In the Days of the Comet, Book 1st, Chapter 2nd, Sections 1 and 2. Section 1. Chapter the 2nd, Nettie, Section 1. I cannot now remember, the story resumed, what interval separated that evening on which Parload first showed me the comet. I think I only pretended to see it then, and the Sunday afternoon I spent at Cheeks Hill. Between the two there was time enough for me to give notice and leave Rawdon's, to seek for some other situation very strenuously in vain, to think and say many hard and violent things to my mother and to Parload, and to pass through some phases of very profound wretchedness. There must have been a passionate correspondence with Nettie, but all the froth and fury of that has faded now out of my memory. All I have clear now is that I wrote one magnificent farewell to her, casting her off forever, and that I got in reply a prim little note to say, but even if there was to be an end to everything, that was no excuse for writing such things as I had done. And then I think I wrote again in a vein I considered satirical. To that she did not reply. That interval was at least 3 weeks and probably 4, because the comet, which had been on the first occasion only a dubious speck in the sky, certainly visible only when it was magnified, was now a great white presence, brighter than Jupiter, and casting a shadow on its own account. It was now actively present in the world of human thought. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was looking for its waxing splendour as the sun went down. The papers, the music halls, the hoardings echoed it. Yes, the comet was already dominant before I went over to make everything clear to Nettie, and Parload had spent £200 in buying himself a spectroscope so that he could see for himself night after night that mysterious, that stimulating line, the unknown line in the green. How many times, I wonder, did I look at the smudgy quivering symbol of the unknown things that were rushing upon us out of the inhuman void, before I rebelled? But at last I could stand it no longer, and I reproached Parload very bitterly for wasting his time in astronomical dilettantism. Here, said I, we're on the verge of the biggest lockout in the history of this countryside. Here's distress and hunger coming. Here's all the capitalistic competitive system like a wound inflamed, and you spend your time gaping at that damned silly streak of nothing in the sky. Parload stared at me. Yes, I do, he said slowly, as though it was a new idea. Don't I? I wonder why. I want to start meetings of an evening on Howden's Waste. You think they'd listen? They'd listen fast enough now. They didn't before, said Parload, looking at his pet instrument. There was a demonstration of unemployed at Swathinglea on Sunday. They got to stone throwing. They'd said nothing for a little while, and I said several things. He seemed to be considering something. But, after all, he said at last with an awkward movement towards the spectroscope, that does signify something. The comet? Yes. What can it signify? You don't want me to believe in astrology. What does it matter what flames in the heavens when men are starving on earth? It's science. Science! What we want now is socialism, not science. He still seemed reluctant to give up his comet. Socialism's all right, he said, but if that thing up there was to hit the earth, it might. Nothing matters but human beings. Suppose it killed them all. Oh, said I, that's rot. I wonder, said Parload, dreadfully divided in his allegiance. He looked at the comet. He seemed on the verge of repeating his growing information about the nearness of the paths of the earth and comet, and all that might ensue from that. So I cut in with something I had got out of a now-forgotten writer called Ruskin, a volcano of beautiful language and nonsensical suggestions, who prevailed very greatly with eloquent, excitable young men in those days. Something it was about the insignificance of science and the supreme importance of life. Parload stood listening, half turned towards the sky with the tips of his fingers on his spectroscope. He seemed to come to a sudden decision. No, I don't agree with you, Leadford, he said. You don't understand about science. Parload rarely argued with that bluntness of opposition. I was so used to entire possession of our talk that his brief contradiction struck me like a blow. Don't agree with me, I repeated. No, said Parload. But how? I believe science is of more importance than socialism, he said. Socialism's a theory. Science is something more. And that was really all he seemed to be able to say. We embarked upon one of those queer arguments illiterate young men used always to find so heating. Science or socialism? It was, of course, like arguing which is right, left-handedness or a taste for onions. It was altogether impossible opposition. But the range of my rhetoric enabled me at last to exasperate Parload, and his mere repudiation of my conclusions sufficed to exasperate me, and we ended in the key of a positive quarrel. Oh, very well, said I, so long as I know where we are. I slammed his door as though I dynamited his house, and went raging down the street, but I felt that he was already back at the window, worshipping his blessed line in the green before I got round the corner. I had to walk for an hour or so before I was cool enough to go home. And it was Parload who had first introduced me to socialism. Recreant. The most extraordinary things used to run through my head in those days. I will confess that my mind ran persistently that evening upon revolutions after the best French pattern, and I sat on a committee of safety and tried backsliders. Parload was there, among the prisoners, backsliderissimus, aware too late of the error of his ways. His hands were tied behind his back, ready for the shambles. Through the open door one heard the voice of justice, the rude justice of the people. I was sorry, but I had to do my duty. If we punish those who would betray us to kings, said I with a sorrowful deliberation, how much the more must we punish those who would give over the state to the pursuit of useless knowledge? And so with a gloomy satisfaction sent him off to the guillotine. Parload, Parload, if only you'd listened to me earlier, Parload. Nonetheless, that quarrel made me extremely unhappy. Parload was my only gossip, and it cost me much to keep away from him and think evil of him with no one to listen to me, evening after evening. That was a very miserable time for me. Even before my last visit to Chex, my long unemployed hours hung heavily on my hands. I kept away from home all day, partly to support a fiction that I was sedulously seeking another situation, and partly to escape the persistent question in my mother's eyes. Why did you quarrel with Mr. Rawdon? Why did you? Why do you keep on going about with a sullen face and risk offending it more? I spent most of the morning in the newspaper room of the public library, writing impossible applications for impossible posts. I remember that among other things of the sort, I offered my services to a firm of private detectives, a sinister breed of traders upon base jealousies, now happily vanished from the world, and wrote apropos of an advertisement for stevedores, that I did not know what the duties of a stevedore might be, but that I was apt and willing to learn. And in the afternoons and evenings I wandered through the strange lights and shadows of my native valley, and hated all created things, until my wanderings were checked by the discovery that I was wearing out my boots, the stagnant, inconclusive malaria of that time. I perceived that I was an evil-tempered, ill-disposed youth with a great capacity for hatred, but there was an excuse for hate. It was wrong of me to hate individuals, to be rude, harsh, and vindictive to this person or that, but indeed it would have been equally wrong to have taken the manifest offer life made me without resentment. I see now clearly and calmly, what I then felt obscurely and with an unbalanced intensity, that my conditions were intolerable. My work was tedious and laborious, and it took up an unreasonable proportion of my time. I was ill-clothed, ill-fed, ill-housed, ill-educated, and ill-trained. My will was suppressed and cramped to the pitch of torture. I had no reasonable pride in myself and no reasonable chance of putting anything right. It was a life hardly worth living. That a large proportion of the people about me had no better a lot, that many had a worse, does not affect these facts. It was a life in which contentment would have been disgraceful. If some of them were contented or resigned, so much the worse for everyone. No doubt it was hasty and foolish of me to throw up my situation, but everything was so obviously aimless and foolish in our social organization that I do not feel disposed to blame myself even for that, except in so far as it pained my mother and caused her anxiety. Think of the one comprehensive fact of the lockout. That year was a bad year, a year of worldwide economic disorganization. Through their want of intelligent direction, the great trust of American ironmasters, a gang of energetic, narrow-minded furnace owners, had smelted far more iron than the whole world had any demand for. In those days there existed no means of estimating any need of that sort beforehand. They had done this without even consulting the ironmasters of any other country. During their period of activity, they had drawn into their employment a great number of workers and had erected a huge productive plant. It is manifestly just that people who do headlong, stupid things of this sort should suffer. But in the old days it was quite possible. It was customary for the real blunderers in such disasters to shift nearly all the consequences of their incapacity. No one thought it wrong for a light-witted captain of industry, who had led his workpeople into overproduction, into the disproportionate manufacture, that is to say, of some particular article, to abandon and dismiss them, nor was there anything to prevent the sudden, frantic underselling of some trade rival in order to surprise and destroy his trade, secure his customers for one's own destined needs, and shift a portion of one's punishment upon him. This operation of spasmodic underselling was known as dumping. The American ironmasters were now dumping on the British market. The British employers were, of course, taking their loss out of their workpeople as much as possible, but in addition they were agitating for some legislation that would prevent not stupid relative excess in production, but dumping, not the disease, but the consequences of the disease. The necessary knowledge to prevent either dumping or its causes, the uncorrelated production of commodities, did not exist, but this hardly weighed with them at all, and in answer to their demands there had arisen a curious party of retaliatory protectionists who combined vague proposals for spasmodic responses to these convulsive attacks from foreign manufacturers with the very evident intention of achieving financial adventures. The dishonest and reckless elements were indeed so evident in this movement as to add very greatly to the general atmosphere of distrust and insecurity, and in the recoil from the prospect of fiscal power in the hands of the class of men known as the new financiers. One heard frightened old-fashioned statesmen asserting with passion that dumping didn't occur, or that it was a very charming sort of thing to happen. Nobody would face and handle the rather intricate truth of the business. The whole effect upon the mind of a cool observer was of a covey of unsubstantial jabbering minds drifting over a series of irrational economic cataclysms. Prices and employment tumbled about like towers in an earthquake, and amidst the shifting masses were the common workpeople going on with their lives as well as they could, suffering, perplexed, unorganized, and for anything but violent, fruitless protests, impotent. You cannot hope now to understand the infinite want of adjustment in the old order of things. At one time there were people dying of actual starvation in India, while men were burning unsaleable wheat in America. It sounds like the account of a particularly mad dream, does it not? It was a dream from which no one on earth expected an awakening. To us youngsters, with the positiveness, the rationalism of youth, it seemed that the strikes and lockouts, the overproduction and misery, could not possibly result simply from ignorance and want of thought and feeling. We needed more dramatic factors than these mental fogs, these mere atmospheric devils. We fled, therefore, to that common refuge of the unhappy ignorant, a belief in callous, insensate plots, we called them plots, against the poor. You can still see how we figured it in any museum by looking up the caricatures of capital and labor that adorned the German and American socialistic papers of the old time. End of section 1. Section 2. I had cast Nettie off in an eloquent epistle, had really imagined the affair was over forever. I've done with women, I said to Parload, and then there was silence for more than a week. Before that week was over, I was wondering with a growing emotion what next would happen between us. I found myself thinking constantly of Nettie, picturing her, sometimes with stern satisfaction, sometimes with sympathetic remorse, mourning, regretting, realizing the absolute end that had come between us. At the bottom of my heart, I no more believed that there was an end between us than that an end would come to the world. Had we not kissed one another? Had we not achieved an atmosphere of whispering nearness, breached our virgin shyness with one another? Of course she was mine, of course I was hers, and separations and final quarrels and harshness and distance were no more than flourishes upon that eternal fact. So at least I felt the thing, however I shaped my thoughts. Whenever my imagination got to work, as that week drew to its close, she came in as a matter of course. I thought of her recurrently all day and dreamt of her at night. On Saturday night I dreamt of her very vividly. Her face was flushed and wet with tears, her hair a little disordered, and when I spoke to her she turned away. In some manner this dream left in my mind a feeling of distress and anxiety. In the morning I had a raging thirst to see her. That Sunday my mother wanted me to go to church very particularly. She had a double reason for that. She thought that it would certainly exercise a favourable influence upon my search for a situation throughout the next week, and in addition Mr. Gabbitas, with a certain mystery behind his glasses, had promised to see what he could do for me, and she wanted to keep him up to that promise. I half consented, and then my desire for Nettie took hold of me. I told my mother I wasn't going to church, and set off about 11 to walk the 17 miles to Cheeks Hill. It greatly intensified the fatigue of that long tramp, that the sole of my boot presently split at the toe, and after I had cut the flapping portion off, a nail worked through and began to torment me. However, the boot looked all right after that operation and gave no audible hint of my discomfort. I got some bread and cheese at a little inn on the way, and was in Checkshill Park about 4. I did not go by the road past the house and so round to the gardens, but cut over the crest beyond the second keeper's cottage, along a path Nettie used to call her own. It was a mere deer track. It led up a miniature valley and through a pretty dell in which we had been accustomed to meet, and so through the hollies and along a narrow path close by the wall of the shrubbery to the gardens. In my memory, that walk through the park before I came upon Nettie stands out very vividly. The long tramp before it is foreshortened to a mere effect of dusty road and painful boot. But the bracken valley and the sudden tumult of doubts and unwanted expectations that came to me stands out now as something significant, as something unforgettable, something essential to the meaning of all that followed. Where should I meet her? What would she say? I had asked these questions before and found an answer. Now they came again with a trail of fresh implications, and I had no answer for them at all. As I approached Nettie, she ceased to be the mere butt of my egotistical self-projection, the custodian of my sexual pride, and drew together and became over and above this a personality of her own, a personality and a mystery, a sphinx I had evaded, only to meet again. I find a little difficulty in describing the quality of the old world love-making so that it may be understandable now. We young people had practically no preparation at all for the stir and emotions of adolescence. Towards the young, the world maintained a conspiracy of stimulating silences. There came no initiation. There were books, stories of a curiously conventional kind that insisted on certain qualities in every love affair and greatly intensified one's natural desire for them: perfect trust, perfect loyalty, lifelong devotion. Much of the complex essentials of love were altogether hidden. One read these things, got accidental glimpses of this and that, wondered and forgot, and so one grew. Then, strange emotions, novel, alarming desires, dreams strangely charged with feeling, an inexplicable impulse of self-abandonment began to tickle queerly amongst the familiar, purely egotistical and materialistic things of boyhood and girlhood. We were like misguided travellers who had camped in the dry bed of a tropical river. Presently we were knee-deep and neck-deep in the flood. Our beings were suddenly going out from ourselves, seeking other beings. We knew not why. This novel craving for abandonment to someone of the other sex bore us away. We were ashamed and full of desire. We kept the thing a guilty secret, and were resolved to satisfy it against all the world. In this state it was, we drifted in the most accidental way against some other blindly seeking creature, and linked like nascent atoms. We were obsessed by the books we read, by all the talk about us, that once we had linked ourselves, we were linked for life. Then afterwards we discovered that other was also an egotism, a thing of ideas and impulses that failed to correspond with ours. So it was, I say, with the young of my class and most of the young people in our world. So it came about that I sought Nettie on the Sunday afternoon and suddenly came upon her, light-bodied, slenderly feminine, hazel-eyed, with her soft, sweet young face under the shady brim of her hat of straw, the pretty Venus I had resolved should be wholly and exclusively mine. There, all unaware of me still, she stood, my essential feminine, the embodiment of the inner thing in life for me, and moreover an unknown other, a person like myself. She held a little book in her hand, open as if she were walking along and reading it. That chanced to be her pose, but indeed she was standing quite still, looking away towards the grey and lichenous shrubbery wall, and, as I think now, listening. Her lips were a little apart, curved to that faint, sweet shadow of a smile.
Section 3. I recall with a vivid precision her queer start when she heard the rustle of my approaching feet, her surprise, her eyes almost of dismay for me. I could recollect, I believe, every significant word she spoke during our meeting, and most of what I said to her. At least it seems I could, though indeed I may deceive myself. But I will not make the attempt. We were both too ill-educated to speak out our full meanings. We stamped out our feelings with clumsy, stereotyped phrases. You who are better taught would fail to catch our intention. The effect would be inanity. But our first words I may give you, because though they conveyed nothing to me at the time, afterwards they meant much. You, Willie, she said. I have come, I said, forgetting in the instant all the elaborate things I had intended to say. I thought I would surprise you. Surprise me? Yes. She stared at me for a moment. I can see her pretty face now as it looked at me, her impenetrable, dear face. She laughed a queer little laugh, and her color went for a moment, and then, so soon as she had spoken, came back again. Surprise me at what? She said with a rising note. I was too intent to explain myself to think of what might lie in that. I wanted to tell you, I said, that I didn't mean quite the things I put in my letter. Section 4. When I and Nettie had been 16, we had been just of an age and contemporaries altogether. Now we were a year and 3/4 older, and her metamorphosis was almost complete, and I was still only at the beginning of a man's long adolescence. In an instant she grasped the situation. The hidden motives of her quick-ripened little mind flashed out their intuitive scheme of action. She treated me with that neat perfection of understanding a young woman has for a boy. "But how did you come?" she asked. I told her I had walked. "Walked?" In an instant she was leading me towards the gardens. I must be tired. I must come home with her at once and sit down. Indeed, it was near tea time. The Stewarts had tea at that old-fashioned hour of 5. Everyone would be so surprised to see me. Fancy walking, fancy. But she supposed a man thought nothing of 17 miles. When could I have started? All the while keeping me at a distance, without even the touch of her hand. "But, Nettie, I came over to talk to you." "My dear boy, tea first, if you please. And besides, aren't we talking?" The "dear boy" was a new note that sounded oddly to me. She quickened her pace a little. "I wanted to explain," I began. Whatever I wanted to explain, I had no chance to do so. I said a few discrepant things, and she answered rather by her intonation than her words. When we were well past the shrubbery, she slackened a little in her urgency, and so we came along the slope under the beeches to the garden. She kept her bright, straightforward-looking, girlish eyes on me as we went. It seemed she did so all the time, but now I know, better than I did then, that every now and then she glanced over me and behind me towards the shrubbery. And all the while, behind her quick, breathless, inconsecutive talk, she was thinking. Her dress marked the end of her transition. Can I recall it? Not, I am afraid, in the terms a woman would use. But her bright brown hair, which had once flowed down her back in a jolly pigtail tied with a bit of scarlet ribbon, was now caught up into an intricacy of pretty curves above her little ear and cheek and the soft long lines of her neck. Her white dress had descended to her feet. Her slender waist, which had once been a mere geographical expression, an imaginary line like the equator, was now a thing of flexible beauty. A year ago she had been a pretty girl's face, sticking out from a little unimportant frock that was carried upon an extremely active and efficient pair of brown stocking legs. Now there was coming a strange new body that flowed beneath her clothes with a sensuous insistence. Every movement, and particularly the novel droop of her hand and arm to the unaccustomed skirts she gathered about her, and a graceful forward inclination that had come to her, called softly to my eyes. A very fine scarf, I suppose you would call it a scarf, of green gossamer, that some new wakened instinct had told her to fling about her shoulders, clung now closely to the young undulations of her body, and now streamed fluttering out for a moment in a breath of wind, and like some shy independent tentacle with a secret to impart, came into momentary contact with my arm. She caught it back and reproved it. We went through the green gate in the high garden wall. I held it open for her to pass through, for this was one of my restricted stock of stiff politenesses, and then for a second she was near touching me. So we came to the trim array of flower beds near the head gardener's cottage and the vistas of glass on our left. We walked between the box edgings and beds of begonias and into the shadow of a yew hedge, within 20 yards of that very pond with the goldfish at whose brim we had plighted our vows. And so we came to the wisteria smothered porch. The door was wide open, and she walked in before me. "Guess who's come to see us?" she cried. Her father answered indistinctly from the parlor, and a chair creaked. I judged he was disturbed in his nap. "Mother," she called in her clear young voice. "Puss, Puss was her sister. She told them in a marveling key that I had walked all the way from Clayton, and they gathered about me and echoed her notes of surprise. "You better sit down, Willie," said her father, "now you have got here. How's your mother?" He looked at me curiously as he spoke. He was dressed in his Sunday clothes, a sort of brownish tweeds, but the waistcoat was unbuttoned for greater comfort in his slumbers. He was a brown-eyed, ruddy man, and I still have now in my mind the bright effect of the red-golden hairs that started out from his cheek to flow down into his beard. He was short but strongly built, and his beard and mustache were the biggest things about him. She had taken all the possibilities of beauty he possessed, his clear skin, his bright hazel-brown eyes, and wedded them to a certain quickness she got from her mother. Her mother I remember as a sharp-eyed woman of great activity. She seems to me now to have been perpetually bringing in or taking out meals or doing some such service, and to me, for my mother's sake and my own, she was always welcoming and kind. Puss was a youngster of 14 perhaps, of whom a hard bright stare and a pale skin like her mother's are the chief traces on my memory. All these people were very kind to me, and among them there was a common recognition, sometimes very agreeably finding expression, that I was clever. They all stood about me as if they were a little at a loss. "Sit down," said her father. "Give him a chair, Puss." We talked a little stiffly. They were evidently surprised by my sudden apparition, dusty, fatigued, and white-faced. But Nettie did not remain to keep the conversation going. "There," she cried suddenly, as if she were vexed, "I declare!" And she darted out of the room. "Lord, what a girl it is," said Mr. Stewart. "I don't know what's come to her." It was half an hour before Nettie came back. It seemed a long time to me, and yet she had been running, for when she came in again she was out of breath. In the meantime I had thrown out casually that I had given up my place at Rawdon's. "I can do better than that," I said. "I left my book in the dell," she said, panting. "Is tea ready?" And that was her apology. We didn't shake down into comfort even with the coming of the tea things. Tea at the gardener's cottage was a serious meal, with a big cake and little cakes and preserves and fruit, a fine spread upon a table. You must imagine me sullen, awkward, and preoccupied, perplexed by the something that was inexplicably unexpected in Nettie, saying little and glowering across the cake at her, and all the eloquence I had been concentrating on for the previous 24 hours miserably lost somewhere in the back of my mind. Nettie's father tried to set me talking. He had a liking for my gift of ready speech, for his own ideas came with difficulty, and it pleased and astonished him to hear me pouring out my views. Indeed, over there I was, I think, even more talkative than with Parload, though to the world at large I was a shy young lout. "You ought to write it out for the newspaper," he used to say. "That's what you ought to do. I never heard such nonsense." Or, "You've got the gift of gab, young man. We ought had made a lawyer of you." But that afternoon, even in his eyes, I didn't shine. Failing any other stimulus, he reverted to my search for a situation, but even that did not engage me. Section 5. For a long time I feared I should have to go back to Clayton without another word to Nettie. She seemed insensible to the need I felt for a talk with her, and I was thinking even of a sudden demand for that before them all. It was a transparent maneuver of her mother's, who had been watching my face, that sent us out at last together to do something. I forgot now what, in one of the greenhouses. Whatever that little mission may have been, it was the merest, most barefaced excuse, a door to shut or a window to close, and I don't think it got done. Nettie hesitated and obeyed. She led the way through one of the hothouses. It was a low, steamy, brick-floored alley between staging that bore a close crowd of pots and ferns. and behind big branching plants that were spread and nailed overhead so as to make an impervious cover of leaves. And in that close green privacy she stopped and turned on me suddenly like a creature at bay. "Isn't the maidenhair fern lovely?" she said, and looked at me with eyes that said, "Now." "Nettie," I began, "I was a fool to write to you as I did." She startled me by the assent that flashed out upon her face, but she said nothing and stood waiting. "Nettie," I plunged, "I can't do without you. I love you." "If you loved me," she said trimly, watching the white fingers she plunged among the green branches of a selaginella, "could you write the things you do to me?" "I don't mean them," I said, "at least not always." I thought really they were very good letters, and that Nettie was stupid to think otherwise, but I was for the moment clearly aware of the impossibility of conveying that to her. "You wrote them." "But then I tramped 17 miles to say I don't mean them." "Yes, but perhaps you do." I think I was at a loss. Then I said, but not very clearly, "I don't." "You think you love me, Willie, but you don't." "I do, Nettie. You know I do." For answer she shook her head. I made what I thought was a most heroic plunge. "Nettie," I said, "I'd rather have you than my own opinions." The selaginella still engaged her. "You think so now," she said. I broke out into protestations. "No," she said shortly. "It's different now." "But why should 2 letters make so much difference?" I said. "It isn't only the letters, but it is different. It's different for good." She halted a little with that sentence, seeking her expression. She looked up abruptly into my eyes and moved, indeed slightly, but with the intimation that she thought our talk might end. But I did not mean it to end like that. "For good?" said I. "Nettie, you don't mean that." "I do," she said deliberately, still looking at me, and with all her poise conveying her finality, she seemed to brace herself for the outbreak that must follow. Of course I became wordy, but I did not submerge her. She stood entrenched, firing her contradictions like guns into my scattered discursive attack. I remember that our talk took the absurd form of disputing whether I could be in love with her or not. And there was I, present in evidence, in a deepening and widening distress of soul because she could stand there, defensive, brighter and prettier than ever, and in some inexplicable way cut off from me and inaccessible. You know, we had never been together before without little enterprises of endearment, without a faintly guilty, quite delightful excitement. I pleaded, I argued. I tried to show that even my harsh and difficult letters came from my desire to come wholly into contact with her. I made exaggerated, fine statements of the longings I felt for her when I was away, of the shock and misery of finding her estranged and cool. She looked at me, feeling the emotion of my speech and impervious to its ideas. I had no doubt, whatever poverty in my words, coolly written down now, that I was eloquent then. I meant most intensely what I said. Indeed, I was wholly concentrated upon it. I was set upon conveying to her with absolute sincerity my sense of distance and the greatness of my desire. I toiled towards her painfully and obstinately through a jungle of words. Her face changed very slowly, by such imperceptible degrees as when at dawn light comes into a clear sky. I could feel that I touched her, that her hardness was in some manner melting, her determination softening toward hesitations. The habit of an old familiarity lurked somewhere within her, but she would not let me reach her. "No," she cried abruptly, starting into motion. She laid a hand on my arm. A wonderful new friendliness came into her voice. "It's impossible, Willie. Everything is different now. everything. We made a mistake. We two young sillies made a mistake, and everything is different forever. Yes, yes. She turned about. Nettie, cried I, and still protesting, pursued her along the narrow alley between the staging towards the hothouse door. I pursued her like an accusation, and she went before me like one who is guilty and ashamed. So I recall it now. She would not let me talk to her again. Yet I could see that my talk to her had altogether abolished the clear-cut distance of our meeting in the park. Ever and again I found her hazel eyes upon me. They expressed something novel, a surprise, as though she realized an unwonted relationship and a sympathetic pity, and still something defensive. When we got back to the cottage, I fell talking rather more freely with her father about the nationalization of railways, and my spirit and temper had so far mended at the realization that I could still produce an effect upon Nettie that I was even playful with Puss. Miss Stuart judged from that things were better with me than they were, and began to beam mightily. But Nettie remained thoughtful and said very little. She was lost in perplexities I could not fathom, and presently she slipped away from us and went upstairs. Section 6. I was, of course, too footsore to walk back to Clayton, but I had a shilling and a penny in my pocket for the train between Checkshill and the 2-mile stone, and that much of the distance I proposed to do in the train. And when I got ready to go, Nettie amazed me by waking up to the most remarkable solicitude for me. I must, she said, go by the road. It was altogether too dark for the short way to the lodge gates. I pointed out that it was moonlight. With the Comet thrown in, said old Stuart. No, she insisted, you must go by the road. I still disputed. She was standing near me. To please me, she urged, in a quick undertone, and with a persuasive look that puzzled me. Even in the moment I asked myself, why should this please her? I might have agreed had she not followed that up with, the hollies by the shrubbery are as dark as pitch, and there's the deerhounds. I'm not afraid of the dark, said I, nor of the deerhounds either. But those dogs, supposing one was loose? That was a girl's argument. A girl who still had to understand that fear is an overt argument only for her own sex. I thought, too, of those grisly, lank brutes straining at their chains, and the chorus they could make of a night when they heard belated footsteps along the edge of the killing wood, and the thought banished my wish to please her. Like most imaginative natures, I was acutely capable of dreads and retreats, and constantly occupied with their suppression and concealment, and to refuse the short cut when it might appear that I did it on account of half a dozen almost certainly chained dogs was impossible. So I set off in spite of her, feeling valiant and glad to be so easily brave, but a little sorry that she should think herself crossed by me. A thin cloud veiled the moon, and the way under the beeches was dark and indistinct. I was not so preoccupied with my love affairs as to neglect what I will confess was always my custom at night across that wild and lonely park. I made myself a club by fastening a big flint to one end of my twisted handkerchief and tying the other about my wrist, and with this in my pocket went on comforted. And it chanced that as I emerged from the hollies by the corner of the shrubbery, I was startled to come unexpectedly upon a young man in evening dress smoking a cigar. I was walking on turf, so that the sound I made was slight. He stood clear in the moonlight. His cigar glowed like a blood-red star, and it did not occur to me at the time that I advanced toward him almost invisibly in an impenetrable shadow. "Hello!" he cried with a sort of amiable challenge. "I am here first." I came out into the light. "Who cares if you are?" said I. I had jumped at once to an interpretation of his words. I knew that there was an intermittent dispute between the house people and the villager public about the use of this track, and it is needless to say where my sympathies fell in that dispute. "Eh?" he cried in surprise. "Thought I would run away, I suppose," said I, and came close up to him. All my enormous hatred of his class had flared up at the sight of his costume, at the fancied challenge of his words. I knew him. He was Edward Verrall, son of the man who owned not only this great estate, but more than half of Rawdon's pot bank, and who had interest and possessions, collieries and rents all over the district of the Four Towns. He was a gallant youngster, people said, and very clever. Young as he was, there was talk of Parliament for him. He had been a great success at the university, and he was being sedulously popularized among us. He took with a light confidence, as a matter of course, advantages that I would have faced the rack to get, and I firmly believed myself a better man than he. He was, as he stood there, a concentrated figure of all that filled me with bitterness. One day he had stopped in a motor outside our house, and I remember the thrill of rage with which I had noted the dutiful admiration in my mother's eyes as she peered through her blind at him. "That's young Mr. Verrall," she said. "They say he's very clever." "They would," I answered. "Damn them and him. But that is by the way." He was clearly astonished to find himself face to face with a man. His note changed. "Who the devil are you?" he asked. My retort was the cheap expedient of re-echoing, "Who the devil are you?" "Well," he said, "I'm coming along this path if I like," I said. "See? It's a public path, just as this used to be public land. You've stolen the land, you and yours, and now you want to steal the right of way. You'll ask us to get off the face of the earth next. I shan't oblige, see?" I was shorter, and I suppose a couple of years younger than he, but I had the improvised club in my pocket gripped ready, and I would have fought with him very cheerfully. But he fell a step backward as I came toward him. "Socialist, I presume," he said, alert and quiet, with the faintest note of badinage. "One of many. We're all socialists nowadays," he remarked philosophically, "and I haven't the faintest intention of disputing your right of way." "You better not," I said. "No." "No." He replaced his cigar, and there was a brief pause. "Catching a train?" he threw out. It seemed absurd not to answer. "Yes," I said shortly. He said it was a pleasant evening for a walk. I hovered for a moment, and there was my path before me, and he stood aside. There seemed nothing to do but go on. "Good night," said he, as that intention took effect. I growled a surly good night. I felt like a bombshell of swearing that must presently burst with some violence as I went on my silent way. He had so completely got the best of our encounter. Section 7. There comes a memory, an odd intermixture of two entirely divergent things, that stands out with the intensest vividness. As I went across the last open meadow, following the short cut to Checkshill Station, I perceived I had two shadows. The thing jumped into my mind and stopped its tumid flow for a moment. I remember the intelligent detachment of my sudden interest. I turned sharply and stood looking at the moon and the great white comet that the drift of the clouds had now rather suddenly unveiled. The comet was perhaps 20 degrees from the moon. What a wonderful thing it looked floating there, a greenish-white apparition in the dark blue deeps. It looked brighter than the moon because it was smaller, but the shadow it cast, though clearer cut, was much fainter than the moon's shadow. I went on, noting these facts, watching my two shadows precede me. I am totally unable to account for the sequence of my thoughts on this occasion, but suddenly, as if I had come on this new fact round a corner, the comet was out of my mind again, and I was face to face with an absolutely new idea. I wonder sometimes if the two shadows I cast one with a sort of feminine faintness with regard to the other, and not quite so tall, may not have suggested the word or the thought of an assignation to my mind. All that I have clear is that with the certitude of intuition, I knew what it was that had brought the youth in the evening dress outside the shrubbery. Of course, he had come to meet Nettie. Once the mental process was started, it took no time at all. The day, which had been full of perplexities for me, the mysterious invisible thing that had held Nettie and myself apart, the unaccountable strange something in her manner, was revealed and explained. I knew now why she had looked guilty at my appearance, what had brought her out that afternoon, why she had hurried me in, the nature of the book she had run back to fetch, the reason why she had wanted me to go back by the high road, and why she had pitied me. It was all in the instant clear to me. You must imagine me a black little creature suddenly stricken still, for a moment standing rigid, and then again suddenly becoming active with an impotent gesture, becoming audible with an inarticulate cry, with two little shadows mocking my dismay. And about this figure you must conceive a great wide space of moonlit grass, rimmed by the looming suggestion of distant trees very low and faint and dim, and over it all the domed serenity of that wonderful luminous night. For a little while this realization stunned my mind. My thoughts came to a pause, staring at my discovery. Meanwhile, my feet in my previous direction carried me through the warm darkness to Checkshill Station with its little lights, to the ticket office window, and so to the train. I remember myself, as it were, waking up to the thing. I was alone in one of the dingy third-class compartments of that time, and the sudden, nearly frantic insurgence of my rage. I stood up with the cry of an angry animal, and smote my fist with all my strength against the panel of wood before me. Curiously enough, I have completely forgotten my mood after that for a little while. But I know that later, for a minute perhaps, I hung for a time out of the carriage with the door open, contemplating a leap from the train. It was to be a dramatic leap, and then I would go storming back to her, denounce her, overwhelm her, and I hung, urging myself to do it. I don't remember how it was I decided not to do this at last, but in the end I didn't. When the train stopped at the next station, I had given up all thoughts of going back. I was sitting in the corner of the carriage with my bruised and wounded hand pressed under my arm, and still insensible to its pain, trying to think out clearly a scheme of action that should express the monstrous indignation that possessed me. End of Book 1, Chapter 2, Sections 5, 6, and 7. Book 1, Chapter 3, Sections 1 and 2. "That comet is going to hit the earth," so said one of the two men who got into the train and settled down. "Ah," said the other man, "they do say that it's made of gas, that comet. We shan't blow up, shall us?" What did it matter to me? I was thinking of revenge against the primary conditions of my being. I was thinking of Nettie and her lover. I was firmly resolved he should not have her, though I had to kill them both to prevent it. I did not care what else might happen if only that end was ensured. All my thwarted passions had turned to rage. I would have accepted eternal torment that night without a second thought to be certain of revenge. 100 possibilities of action, 100 stormy situations, a whirl of violent schemes, chased one another through my shamed, exasperated mind. The sole prospect I could endure was of some gigantic, inexorably cruel vindication of my humiliated self. And Nettie? I loved Nettie still, but now with the intensest jealousy, with the keen, unmeasuring hatred of wounded pride and baffled, passionate desire. Section 2. As I came down the hill from Clayton Crest, for my shilling and a penny only permitted my traveling by train as far as 2 Milestone, and thence I had to walk over the hill. I remember very vividly a little man with a shrill voice who was preaching under a gas lamp against a hoarding to a thin crowd of Sunday evening loafers. He was a short man, bald, with a little fair curly beard and hair, and watery blue eyes, and he was preaching that the end of the world drew near. I think that is the first time I heard anyone link the comet with the end of the world. He had got that jumbled up with international politics and prophecies from the book of Daniel. I stopped to hear him only for a moment or so. I do not think I should have halted at all, but his crowd blocked my path, and the sight of his queer wild expression, the gesture of his upward-pointing finger, held me. "This is the end of all your sins and follies," he bawled. There is the star of judgments, the judgments of the Most High God. It is appointed unto all men to die, unto all men to die." His voice changed to a curious flat chant, "And after death the judgment, the judgment." I pushed and threaded my way through the bystanders and went on, and his curious, harsh, flat voice pursued me. I went on with the thoughts that had occupied me before, where I could buy a revolver, and how I might master its use. And probably I should have forgotten all about him had he not taken part in the hideous dream that ended the little sleep I had that night. For the most part, I lay awake thinking of Nettie and her lover. Then came 3 strange days, 3 days that seemed now to have been wholly concentrated upon one business. This dominant business was the purchase of my revolver. I held myself resolutely to the idea that I must either restore myself by some extraordinary act of vigor and violence in Nettie's eyes, or I must kill her. I would not let myself fall away from that. I felt that if I let this matter pass, my last shred of pride and honor would pass with it, that for the rest of my life I should never deserve the slightest respect or any woman's love. Pride kept me to my purpose between my gusts of passion. Yet it was not easy to buy that revolver. I had a kind of shyness of the moment when I should have to face the shopman, and I was particularly anxious to have a story ready if he should see fit to ask questions why I bought such a thing. I determined to say I was going to Texas, and I thought it might prove useful there. Texas in those days had the reputation of a wild, lawless land. As I knew nothing of caliber or impact, I wanted also to be able to ask with a steady face at what distance a man or woman could be killed by the weapon that might be offered me. I was pretty cool-headed in relation to such practical aspects of my affair. I had some little difficulty in finding a gunsmith. In Clayton there were some rook rifles and so forth in a cycle shop, but the only revolvers these people had impressed me as being too small and toy-like for my purpose. It was in a pawnshop window in the narrow high street of Swathinglea that I found my choice. A reasonably clumsy and serious-looking implement ticketed as used in the American Army. I had drawn out my balance from the savings bank, matter of £2 and more, to make this purchase, and I found it at last a very easy transaction. The pawnbroker told me where I could get ammunition, and I went home that night with bulging pockets, an armed man. The purchase of my revolver was, I say, the chief business of those days, but you must not think I was so intent upon it as to be insensible to the stirring things that were happening in the streets through which I went, seeking the means to effect my purpose. They were full of murmurings. The whole region of the 4 towns scowled lowering from its narrow doors. The ordinary healthy flow of people going to work, people going about their business, was chilled and checked. Numbers of men stood about the street in knots and groups, as corpuscles gather and catch in the blood vessels in the opening stage of inflammation. The women looked haggard and worried. The ironworkers had refused the proposed reduction of their wages, and the lockout had begun. They were already at play. The Conciliation Board was doing its best to keep the coal miners and masters from a breach, but young Lord Redcar, the greatest of our coal owners and landlord of all Swathinglea and half of Clayton, was taking a fine, upstanding attitude that made the breach inevitable. He was a handsome young man, a gallant young man. His pride revolted at the idea of being dictated to by a lot of bally miners, and he meant, he said, to make a fight for it. The world had treated him sumptuously from his earliest years. The shares in the common stock of 5,000 people had gone to pay for his handsome upbringing, and large, romantic, expensive ambitions filled his generously nurtured mind. He had early distinguished himself at Oxford by his scornful attitude towards democracy. There was something that appealed to the imagination in his fine antagonism to the crowd. On the one hand was the brilliant young nobleman, picturesquely alone. On the other, the ugly, inexpressive multitude, dressed inelegantly in shop clothes, undereducated, underfed, envious, base, and with a wicked disinclination for work and a wicked appetite for the good things it could so rarely get. For common imaginative purposes, one left out the policeman from the design. The stalwart policeman protecting his lordship, and ignored the fact that while Lord Redcar had his hands immediately and legally on the workmen's shelter and bread, they could touch him to the skin only by some violent breach of the law. He lived at Lowchester House, 5 miles or so beyond Checkshill, but partly to show how little he cared for his antagonist, and partly, no doubt, to keep himself in touch with the negotiations that were still going on, he was visible almost every day in and about the 4 towns, driving that big motor car of his that could take him 60 miles an hour. The English passion for fair play, one might have thought sufficient to rob this bold procedure of any dangerous possibilities. But he did not go altogether free from insult, and on one occasion at least, an intoxicated Irishwoman shook her fist at him. A dark, quiet crowd that was greater each day, a crowd more than half women, brooded, as a cloud will sometimes brood permanently upon a mountain crest, in the market-place outside Clayton Town Hall, where the conference was held. I consider myself justified in regarding Lord Redcar's passing automobile with a special animosity because of the leaks in our roof. We held our little house on lease. The owner was a mean, saving old man named Pettigrew, who lived in a villa adorned with plaster images of dogs and goats at Overcastle, and in spite of our specific agreement, he would do no repairs for us at all. He rested secure in my mother's timidity. Once, long ago, she had been behindhand with her rent, with half of her quarter's rent, and he had extended the days of grace a month. Her sense that some day she might need the same mercy again made her his abject slave. She was afraid even to ask that he should cause the roof to be mended, for fear he might take offense. But one night the rain poured in on her bed and gave her a cold, and stained and soaked her poor old patchwork counterpane. Then she got me to compose an excessively polite letter to old Pettigrew, begging him as a favor to perform his legal obligation. It is part of the general imbecility of those days that such one-sided law as existed was a profound mystery to the common people, its provisions impossible to ascertain, its machinery impossible to set in motion. Instead of the clearly written code, the lucid statements of rules and principles that are now at the service of everyone, the law was the muddled secret of the legal profession. Poor people, overworked people, had constantly to submit to petty wrongs because of the intolerable uncertainty not only of law but of cost, and of the demands upon time and energy proceedings might make. There was indeed no justice for anyone too poor to command a good solicitor's deference and loyalty. There was nothing but rough police protection and the magistrate's grudging or eccentric advice for the mass of the population. The civil law, in particular, was a mysterious upper-class weapon, and I can imagine no injustice that would have been sufficient to induce my poor old mother to appeal to it. All this begins to sound incredible. I can only assure you that it was so. But when I learned that old Pettigrew had been down to tell my mother all about his rheumatism, to inspect the roof, and to allege that nothing was needed, gave way to my most frequent emotion in those days, a burning indignation, and took the matter into my own hands. I wrote and asked him, with a withering air of technicality, to have the roof repaired as per agreement, and added, "If not done in 1 week from now, we shall be obliged to take proceedings." I had not mentioned this high line of conduct to my mother at first, and so when old Pettigrew came down in a state of great agitation with my letter in his hand, she was almost equally agitated. "How could you write to old Mr. Pettigrew like that?" she asked me. I said that old Pettigrew was a shameful old rascal, or words to that effect, and I am afraid I behaved in a very undutiful way to her when she said that she had settled everything with him. She wouldn't say how, but I could guess well enough, and that I was to promise her faithfully, to do nothing more in the matter. I wouldn't promise her, and having nothing better to employ me then, I presently went raging to old Pettigrew in order to put the whole thing before him in what I considered the proper light. Old Pettigrew evaded my illumination. He saw me coming up his front steps. I can still see his queer old nose and the crinkled brow over his eye and the little wisp of gray hair that showed over the corner of his window blind, and he instructed his servant to put up the chain when she answered the door, and to tell me that he would not see me, so I had to fall back upon my pen. Then it was, as I had no idea what were the proper proceedings to take, the brilliant idea occurred to me of appealing to Lord Redcar as the ground landlord, and, as it were, our feudal chief, and pointing out to him that his security for his rent was depreciating in old Pettigrew's hands. I added some general observations on leaseholds, the taxation of ground rents, and the private ownership of the soil. And Lord Redcar, whose spirit revolted at democracy, and who cultivated a pert, humiliating manner with his inferiors to show as much, earned my distinguished hatred forever by causing his secretary to present his compliments to me, and his request that I would mind my own business and leave him to manage his. At which I was so greatly enraged that I first tore this note into minute innumerable pieces, and then dashed it dramatically all over the floor of my room, from which, to keep my mother from the job, I afterward had to pick it up laboriously on all fours. I was still meditating a tremendous retort, an indictment of all Lord Redcar's class, their manners, morals, economic and political crimes, when my trouble with Nettie arose to swamp all minor troubles. Yet not so completely but that I snarled aloud when his lordship's motor car whizzed by me as I went about my long meandering quest for a weapon. And I discovered after a time that my mother had bruised her knee and was lame. Fearing to irritate me by bringing the thing before me again, she had set herself to move her bed out of the way of the drip without my help, and she had knocked her knee. All her poor furnishings, I discovered, were cowering now close to the peeling bedroom walls. There had come a vast discoloration of the ceiling, and a washing tub was in occupation of the middle of her chamber. It is necessary that I should set these things before you, should give you the key of inconvenience and uneasiness in which all things were arranged, should suggest the breath of trouble that stirred among the hot summer streets, the anxiety about the strike, the rumors and indignations, the gatherings and meetings, the increasing gravity of the policemen's faces, the combative headlines of the local papers, the knots of picketers who scrutinized anyone who passed near the silent, smokeless forges. But in my mind, you must understand, such impressions came and went irregularly. They made a moving background, changing undertones, to my preoccupation by that darkly shaping purpose to which a revolver was so imperative and essential. Along the darkling streets, amidst the sullen crowds, the thought of Nettie, my Nettie, and her gentleman lover made ever a vivid, inflammatory spot of purpose in my brain. End of Book 1, Chapter 3, Sections 1 and 2. Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 3. It was 3 days after this, on Wednesday that is to say, that the first of those sinister outbreaks occurred that ended in the bloody affair of Peacock Grove and the flooding out of the entire line of the Swathinglea collieries. It was the only one of these disturbances I was destined to see, and at most a mere trivial preliminary of that struggle. The accounts that have been written of this affair vary very widely. To read them is to realize the extraordinary carelessness of truth that dishonored the press of those latter days. In my bureau I have several files of the daily papers of the old time. I collected them, as a matter of fact, and 3 or 4 of about that date. I have just this moment taken out and looked through to refresh my impressions of what I saw. They lie before me, queer, shriveled, incredible things. The cheap paper has already become brittle and brown and split along the creases. The ink faded or smeared. And I have to handle them with the utmost care when I glance along their raging headlines. As I sit here in this serene place, their quality throughout, their arrangement, their tone, their arguments and exhortations, read as though they came from drugged and drunken men. They give one the effect of faded bawling, of screams and shouts heard faintly in a little gramophone. It is only on Monday, I find, and buried deep below the war news, that these publications contain any intimation that unusual happenings were forward in Clayton and Swathinglea. What I saw was towards evening. I had been learning to shoot with my new possession. I had walked out with it 4 or 5 miles across a patch of moorland and down to a secluded little coppice full of bluebells halfway along the high road between Leet and Stafford. Here I had spent the afternoon experimenting and practicing with careful deliberation and grim persistence. I had brought an old kite frame of cane with me that folded and unfolded, and each shot hole I made I marked and numbered to compare with my other endeavors. At last I was satisfied that I could hit a playing card at 30 paces 9 times out of 10. The light was getting too bad for me to see my penciled bull's-eye, and in that state of quiet moodiness that sometimes comes with hunger to passionate men, I returned by the way of Swathinglea towards my home. The road I followed came down between banks of wretched-looking working men's houses in close-packed rows on either side, and took upon itself the role of Swathinglea High Street, where, at a lamp and a pillar box, the steam trams began. So far, that dirty hot way had been unusually quiet and empty, but beyond the corner, where the first group of beer shops clustered, it became populous. It was very quiet still. Even the children were a little inactive. But there were a lot of people standing dispersedly in little groups, and with a general direction toward the gates of the Bantock Burden coal pit. The place was being picketed, although at that time the miners were still nominally at work, and the conference between the masters and men still in session at Clayton Town Hall. But one of the men employed at the Bantock Burden Pit, Jack Briscoe, was a socialist, and he had distinguished himself by a violent letter upon the crisis to the leading socialist paper in England, the Clarion, in which he had adventured among the motives of Lord Redcar. The publication of this had been followed by instant dismissal. As Lord Redcar wrote a day or so later to the Times, I have that Times. I have all the London papers of the last month before the change. The man was paid off and kicked out. Any self-respecting employer would do the same. The thing had happened overnight, and the men did not at once take a clear line upon what was, after all, a very intricate and debatable occasion. But they came out in a sort of semi-official strike from all of Lord Redcar's collieries beyond the canal that besets Swathinglea. They did so without formal notice, committing a breach of contract by this sudden secession. But in the long labor struggles of the old days, the workers were constantly putting themselves in the wrong and committing illegalities through that overpowering cravings for dramatic promptness natural to uneducated minds. All the men had not come out of the Bantock Burden Pit. Something was wrong there, an indecision if nothing else. The mine was still working, and there was a rumor that men from Durham had been held in readiness by Lord Redcar, and were already in the mine. Now it is absolutely impossible to ascertain certainly how things stood at that time. The newspapers say this and that, but nothing trustworthy remains. I believe I should have gone striding athwart the dark stage of that stagnant industrial drama without asking a question, if Lord Redcar had not chanced to come upon the scene about the same time as myself, and incontinently end its stagnation. He had promised that if the men wanted a struggle, he would put up the best fight they had ever had, and he had been active all that afternoon in meeting the quarrel halfway, and preparing as conspicuously as possible for the scratch force of blacklegs, as we call them, who were, he said, and we believed, to replace the strikers in his pits. I was an eyewitness of the whole of the affair outside the Bantock Burden Pit, and I do not know what happened. Picture to yourself how the thing came to me. I was descending a steep, cobbled, excavated road between banked-up footways, perhaps 6 feet high, upon which in a monotonous series opened the living-room doors of rows of dark low cottages. The perspective of squat blue slate roofs and clustering chimneys drifted downwards towards the irregular open space before the colliery, a space covered with coaly, wheel-scarred mud, with a patch of weedy dumps to the left and the colliery gates to the right. Beyond, the high street with shops resumed again in good earnest and went on, and the lines of the steam tramway that stretched out from before my feet and were here shining and acutely visible with reflected skylight, and here lost in a shadow, took up for one acute moment the greasy yellow irradiation of a newly lit gas lamp as they vanished round the bend. Beyond spread a darkling marsh of homes, an infinitude of little smoking hovels, and emergent meagre churches, public houses, board schools, and other buildings amidst the prevailing chimneys of Swathinglea. To the right, very clear and relatively high, the Bantock Burden pit mouth was marked by a gaunt lattice bearing a great black wheel, very sharp and distinct in the twilight, and beyond, in an irregular perspective, were others following the lie of the seams. The general effect, as one came down the hill, was of a dark, compressed life beneath a very high and wide and luminous evening sky, against which these pit wheels rose. And ruling the calm spaciousness of that heaven was the great comet, now green-white and wonderful for all who had eyes to see. The fading afterglow of the sunset threw up all the contours and skyline to the west, and the comet rose eastward out of the pouring tumult of smoke from Bladden's forges. The moon had still to rise. By this time, the comet had begun to assume the cloud-like form still familiar through the medium of 1,000 photographs and sketches. At first, it had been an almost telescopic speck. It had brightened to the dimensions of the greatest star in the heavens. It had still grown, hour by hour, in its incredibly swift, its noiseless and inevitable rush upon our earth, until it had equaled and surpassed the moon. Now it was the most splendid thing this sky of earth has ever held. I have never seen a photograph that gave a proper idea of it. Never at any time did it assume the conventional tailed outline comets are supposed to have. Astronomers talked of its double tail, one preceding it and one trailing behind it, but these were foreshortened to nothing, so that it had rather the form of a bellying puff of luminous smoke, with an intenser, brighter heart. It rose a hot yellow color, and only began to show its distinctive greenness when it was clear of the mist of the evening. It compelled attention for a space. For all my earthly concentration of mind, I could but stare at it for a moment with a vague anticipation that, after all, in some way so strange and glorious an object must have significance, could not possibly be a matter of absolute indifference to the schemes and values of my life. But how? I thought of Parload. I thought of the panic and uneasiness that was spreading in this very matter, and the assurances of scientific men that the thing weighed so little, at the utmost a few hundred tons of thinly diffused gas and dust, that even were it to smite this earth fully, nothing could possibly ensue. And, after all, said I, what earthly significance has anyone found in the stars? Then, as one still descended, the houses and buildings rose up. The presence of those watching groups of people, the tension of the situation, and one forgot the sky. Preoccupied with myself and with my dark dream about Nettie and my honor, I threaded my course through the stagnating threat of this gathering, and was caught unawares when suddenly the whole scene flashed into drama. The attention of everyone swung round with an irresistible magnetism towards the high street, and caught me as a rush of water might catch a wisp of hay. Abruptly the whole crowd was sounding one note. It was not a word. It was a sound that mingled threat and protest, something between a prolonged "ah" and "ugh." Then, with a hoarse intensity of anger, came a low, heavy booing. Boo! Boo! A note stupidly expressive of animal savagery. Toot, toot, said Lord Redcar's automobile in a ridiculous repartee. Toot, toot. One heard it whizzing and throbbing as the crowd obliged it to slow down. Everybody seemed in motion towards the colliery gates, I, too, with the others. I heard a shout. Through the dark figures about me, I saw the motor car stop and move forward again, and had a glimpse of something writhing on the ground. It was alleged afterwards that Lord Redcar was driving, and that he quite deliberately knocked down a little boy who would not get out of his way. It is asserted with equal confidence that the boy was a man who tried to pass across the front of the motor car as it came slowly through the crowd. who escaped by a hair's breadth and then slipped on the tram rail and fell down. I have both accounts set forth under screaming headlines in two of these serene newspapers upon my desk. No one could ever ascertain the truth. Indeed, in such a blind tumult of passion, could there be any truth? There was a rush forward. The horn of the car sounded. Everything swayed violently to the right for perhaps 10 yards or so, and then there was a report like a pistol shot. For a moment, everyone seemed running away. A woman carrying a shawl-wrapped child blundered into me and sent me reeling back. Everyone thought of firearms, but, as a matter of fact, something had gone wrong with the motor. What in those old-fashioned contrivances was called a backfire. A thin puff of bluish smoke hung in the air behind the thing. The majority of the people staggered back in disorderly fashion and left a clear space about the struggle that centered upon the motor car. The man or boy who had fallen was lying on the ground with no one near him, a black lump, an extended arm, and 2 sprawling feet. The motor car had stopped, and its 3 occupants were standing up. 6 or 7 black figures surrounded the car and appeared to be holding onto it as if to prevent it from starting again. One, it was Mitchell, a well-known labor leader, argued in fierce low tones with Lord Redcar. I could not hear anything they said. I was not near enough. Behind me, the colliery gates were open, and there was a sense of help coming to the motor car from that direction. There was an unoccupied muddy space for 50 yards perhaps between car and gate, and then the wheels and head of the pit rose black against the sky. I was one of a rude semicircle of people that hung, as yet indeterminate in action, about this dispute. It was natural, I suppose, that my fingers should close upon the revolver in my pocket. I advanced with the vaguest intentions in the world, and not so quickly but that several men hurried past me to join the little knot holding up the car. Lord Redcar, in his big furry overcoat, towered up over the group about him. His gestures were free and threatening, and his voice loud. He made a fine figure there, I must admit. He was a big, fair, handsome young man with a fine tenor voice and an instinct for gallant effect. My eyes were drawn to him at first wholly. He seemed a symbol, a triumphant symbol, of all that the theory of aristocracy claims, of all that filled my soul with resentment. His chauffeur sat crouched together, peering at the crowd under his lordship's arm. But Mitchell showed as a sturdy figure also, and his voice was firm and loud. "You've hurt that lad," said Mitchell over and over again. "You wait here till you see if he's hurt." "I'll wait here or not, as I please," said Redcar, and to the chauffeur, "Here, get down and look at it." "You better not get down," said Mitchell, and the chauffeur stood bent and hesitating on the step. The man on the back seat stood up, leant forward, and spoke to Lord Redcar, and for the first time my attention was drawn to him. It was young Verrall. His handsome face shone clear and fine in the green pallor of the Comet. I ceased to hear the quarrel that was raising the voices of Mitchell and Lord Redcar. This new fact sent them spinning into the background. Young Verrall. It was my own purpose coming to meet me halfway. There was to be a fight here. It seemed certain to come to a scuffle. And here we were. What was I to do? I thought very swiftly. Unless my memory cheats me, I acted with swift decision. My hand tightened on my revolver, and then I remembered it was unloaded. I had thought my course out in an instant. I turned round and pushed my way out of the angry crowd that was now surging back towards the motor car. It would be quiet and out of sight, I thought, among the dump heaps across the road, and there I might load unobserved. A big young man, striding forward with his fist clenched, halted for 1 second at the sight of me. "What?" said he. "Ain't afraid of them, are you?" I glanced over my shoulder and back at him, was near showing him my pistol. and the expression changed in his eyes. He hung, perplexed at me. Then with a grunt he went on. I heard the voices growing loud and sharp behind me. I hesitated, half turned towards the dispute, then set off running towards the heaps. Some instinct told me not to be detected loading. I was cool enough, therefore, to think of the aftermath of the thing I meant to do. I looked back once again towards the swaying discussion. Or was it a fight now? And then I dropped into the hollow, knelt among the weeds, and loaded with eager, trembling fingers. I loaded one chamber, got up and went back a dozen paces, thought of possibilities, vacillated, returned and loaded all the others. I did it slowly because I felt a little clumsy, and at the end came a moment of inspection. Had I forgotten anything? And then for a few seconds I crouched before I rose, resisting the first gust of reaction against my impulse. I took thought, and for a moment that great green-white meteor overhead swam back into my conscious mind. For the first time then, I linked it clearly with all the fierce violence that had crept into human life. I joined up that with what I meant to do. I was going to shoot young Verrall, as it were, under the benediction of that green glare. But about Nettie, I found it impossible to think out that obvious complication. I came up over the heap again and walked slowly back towards the wrangle. Of course, I had to kill him. Now, I would have you believe I did not want to murder young Verrall at all at that particular time. I had not pictured such circumstances as these. I had never thought of him in connection with Lord Redcar and our black industrial world. He was in that distant other world of Checkshill, the world of parks and gardens, the world of sunlit emotions and Nettie. His appearance here was disconcerting. I was taken by surprise. I was too tired and hungry to think clearly, and the hard implication of our antagonism prevailed with me. In the tumult of my past emotions, I had thought constantly of conflicts, confrontations, deeds of violence, and now the memory of these things took possession of me as though they were irrevocable resolutions. There was a sharp exclamation, the shriek of a woman, and the crowd came surging back. The fight had begun. Lord Redcar, I believe, had jumped down from his car and felled Mitchell, and men were already running out to his assistance from the colliery gates. I had some difficulty in shoving through the crowd. I can still remember very vividly being jammed at one time between two big men so that my arms were pinned to my sides, but all the other details are gone out of my mind until I found myself almost violently projected forward into the scrap. I blundered against the corner of the motor car and came round it face to face with young Verrall, who was descending from the back compartment. His face was touched with orange from the automobile's big lamps, which conflicted with the shadows of the Comet light and distorted him oddly. That effect lasted but an instant, but it put me out. Then he came a step forward, and the ruddy lights and queerness vanished. I don't think he recognized me, but he perceived immediately I meant attacking. He struck out at once at me a haphazard blow and touched me on the cheek. Instinctively, I let go of the pistol, snatched my right hand out of my pocket, and brought it up in a belated parry, and then let out with my left, full in his chest. It sent him staggering, and as he went back, I saw recognition mingle with astonishment in his face. "You know me, you swine," I cried, and hit again. Then I was spinning sideways, half stunned, with a huge lump of a fist under my jaw. I had an impression of Lord Redcar as a great furry bulk, towering like some Homeric hero above the fray. I went down before him. It made him seem to rush up, and he ignored me further. His big flat voice counseled young Verrall. "Cut, Teddy. It won't do. The Picketa's got a en base." Feet swayed about me, and some hobnailed miner kicked my ankle and went stumbling. There were shouts and curses, and then everything had swept past me. I rolled over on my face and beheld the chauffeur, young Verrall, and Lord Redcar, the latter holding up his long skirts of fur, and making a grotesque figure one behind the other in full bolt across a coldly comet-lit interval towards the open gates of the colliery. I raised myself up on my hands. Young Verrall! I had not even drawn my revolver. I had forgotten it. I was covered with coaly mud, knees, elbows, shoulders, back. I had not even drawn my revolver. A feeling of ridiculous impotence overwhelmed me. I struggled painfully to my feet. I hesitated for a moment towards the gates of the colliery, and then went limping homeward, thwarted, painful, confused, and ashamed. I had not the heart nor desire to help in the wrecking and burning of Lord Redcar's motor. End of Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 3.